Two extracts from Conversations. On Christopher Logue. Christopher Logue's Prince Charming is an absorbing read. It tells the story of the late English poet in three parts. From 1926 to 1951 on his way to Paris, 1951 to 1956 his time in Paris, and 1956 to 1966 his return home to London, where we are left, more or less, with a retrospective of friends lost and a life lived. So far, he writes in 1998, my life has been pretty easy. I have not been driven away from my own country or emotionally betrayed, nor have I had to face a debilitating illness or poverty or professional neglect. I have not seen one close to me suffer terrible damage or go mad or kill themselves. Indeed, sex aside, I have done more or less what I fancied doing, and the greater part of my life has been passed in the company of those who have done likewise. Spliced throughout this first 40 years of his life retold, Logue introduces us to his parents, their parents, his schooling in the Irish Christian Brothers Priory Park College in Bath, his army life in the aftermath of the Second World War, a bizarre story in itself, and the seemingly inevitable fate of his writing life as a poet. Logue recalls a London which has more or less disappeared. The Royal Court Theatre heyday of the 50s and 60s, CND, a forceful creativity which embraced politics and the imagination without po-faced correctness or an eye on the main chance. Everybody knows, Logue writes in one of his darting asides, that until the 50s, British artists, poets included, came from the middle classes, helped out by the occasional aristo, well-to-do gent, or taken up nobody. But since then, those entering the world of the arts have arrived from all parts of the world, many from lower middle class and working class backgrounds. This is the world of Kenneth Tynan and Doris Lessing on the first Aldermaston March of 1958, of George Devine and Lindsay Anderson, of Neil Dunn and Vanessa Redgrave, working with BBC Radio and Logue's versions of Homer, subsequently published as War Music. Fleeting glimpses of the revered Beckett, however, cast long shadows both from the Paris days and later in London. This is Paris, autumn 1955. Beckett arrived unannounced. Having asked if we would care to accept them, Beckett unwrapped a brown paper parcel and distributed copies of his first two books of poems, Horoscope from 1930 and from 5 years later, Echo's Bones. I was having a clear out and found them in a box. There was no great demand for them, he said, sounding pleased. Logue is a great storyteller. One moment we are in one time frame, the next we are in the present looking back, the next we are in a siding pondering his sex life, a thorny question finally resolved by the half-Finnish, half-Welsh daughter of an oil company executive. Or we are wandering down through Portobello, upstairs in Tynan's cool apartment, or bumping into one or other of the real names of post-war English, by which I mean Scottish poetry, such as W.S. Graham, I Answer to Sydney. Eliot was his publisher, remarks Logue of Graham. He, Eliot, loves gossip. He told me that Hemingway went to the lavatory in Pound's Paris Hotel and pulled the chain so hard the cistern came off the wall and knocked him out. Then he claimed his bruises were from defeating 3 Lascars in a street fight. There is, nonetheless, a darker side to Prince Charming, as the young Logue becomes somewhat detached from himself, and is wearied by his life, but saved by his friends. Like Yeats, Logue has been fortunate in not only having the friends he has had, but in keeping them. Their contribution to this book in the form of recorded speech, drawn also from notebooks and diaries, makes for a curiously complete portrait of the poet. A kind of courage shows through the memoir, what used to be called a willfulness, which isn't so common these days. But above all, Christopher Logue has written a great read full of true stories and fascinating people. And the second extract from Conversations is on images. On light and dark. There was a book I read when I was quite young that had a big impact on me. It was called The Poetics of Space, philosophizing about bric-a-brac, cubbyholes, attics and the like. I grew up in a house full of women, and I think that in that particular house and at that particular time there was a place for everything. Everything in that place had its own significance. So, as a young boy, I absorbed it into myself without knowing it or thinking about it. So these items, furniture, clocks, mirrors, became important. All that kind of theatre of women's lives that surrounded me. I felt I was kind of a scene changer, moving in and out, observing them. It almost became like a figure in a Sartre short story. It was physical, it wasn't intellectual. But then, when I discovered this book, it was a bit of a shock. I knew exactly what Bachelard, the author, was talking about. He takes you down into cellars. We didn't have a cellar. I mean the cupboards, the attics. I lived in the attic. That was where I physically lived, where my bedroom was. I had a window that looked over Belfast. There was an unused fireplace, there was a tall boy, and there were these tea chests full of songs and sheet music. So all of this was my surrounding. So when I read Bachelard's book, it was like reading my own history, my own biography. But I didn't think it meant anything until he said it. Well, that these things do actually have significances. If I wanted to be anything other than what I am, I would have been a painter, because I love trying to get the angles right, to see. I'm not all that interested in colour, but the shadow of the angle as light becomes dark. All these lines that separate one thing from another, but are linked together. It's very much down to the fact that I grew up in a society where physically light was important, because when you live in the north, the sun's benign. It's very important. For long stretches of the year, you spend a lot of the time in darkness. Going to school in the morning, it's dark, and by 4 o'clock coming home, it's dark. So light is important. The light of lamps on streets, shop windows, the light flooding out from that. I have very strong recollections of all of that. So maybe it just fed into the poetry as well. One of the images that struck me when I was very small was when we walked up the gangplank looking down at the gap between the ship and the quay and seeing the engine of the ferry starting to churn. It had an extraordinary effect on me that I remember very clearly to this day. The sense that here I was on the gangway between two different things, between the land and the sea, with the ship sitting on the sea. It was both thrilling and frightening at the same time. When the ship takes off out of Belfast, it reverses in and reverses back out again. So you have this strange moment where you're on the ship and you see the loch on either side of you, and it's brilliant. And then you leave the loch and its embrace, and you're out there in the open sea. And that can be both exhilarating but also a little frightening for a kid. I think I carried that with me, so I love being on the sea, but I'm also a little bit anxious about it. If you grew up in the north, you're never too far away from the coast, from the sea. In Belfast, I was 6 minutes away. We used to take a house in Bangor by the sea, and I stayed in a house in Portstewart by the sea, a house in Portrush by the sea. We would have had vertigo if we had gone too far inland. Everywhere we went was by the coast. So when I went to college, it was by the coast. When I moved to Galway, it was by the coast. When I moved to Dún Laoghaire, it was by the coast. It was just like a calling, you know. And even when I was in Switzerland, I pretended that Lake Geneva was the coast because I didn't like the idea I was too far inland. I remember the foghorns and the sirens for work. These sirens had been used to alert people to nightly raids or the possibility of bombing raids during the Second World War. I can hear those to this very day, the sirens of the shipyards, because Belfast was defined by work. Its raison d'etre was industrial. Customs, seasons, holidays, clocks, everything was defined by industry. So that if you're a young kid growing up in that environment, you don't know this because you don't know anything else. But what you do know is the sound of the sirens. People are at work by 8 o'clock, but also nights and the sound of the foghorns. You can hear it. It's like owls hooting, you know, because there's fog in the loch. And that's both exciting because you're sitting there in your attic bedroom, but it's also a bit spooky. It's got the Edgar Allan Poe feel about it. So the foghorn becomes like a siren call. It's like someone calling you away, and then you're not too far away from Homeric possibilities, you know, that you're on the sea.